Are we losing sight of what really matters? In a world where family, motherhood, and human dignity are increasingly devalued, what can ancient Christianity teach us about living with purpose and receiving a sense of worth in a post Christian society? I'm Josh Burtram, host of the Faith Roundtable, co host of Faithful Politics podcast. And today I'm going to be joined by the brilliant Dr. Nadya Williams, historian, author, former professor, who's here to challenge the secular lies that she sees shaping our culture and point us back to the eternal truths that can transform our lives. If you've ever wondered how faith, history, and the call to care for the vulnerable intersect, this conversation is for you. Stay tuned. It's not one that you're going to want to miss. And again, like and subscribe. Share this with someone that you think needs it. Thanks so much for joining us. Without further ado, let's get into the good stuff. Hi there, this is Josh Burtram, your host on the Faith Roundtable. Make sure you guys are liking and subscribing and also looking at our Faithful Politics page and our sister podcast where you can get all sorts of other interviews. And we are excited today to have with us Nadya Williams, Dr. Nadya Williams, and talk to her about her book, Mothers, Children, and the Body, Politic, Ancient Christianity, and the Recovery of Human Dignity. Nadia walked away from academia after 15 years as a professor of history and classics. She's now a homeschool mom, book managing editor, rather, at Current and contributing editor at Providence Magazine. She's the author of Cultural Christians in the Early Church, through Zondervan Academic and numerous articles and essays in Current, Plow, Christianity Today, Front Porch Republic, Fair Disputations, Law and Liberty, Church Life Journal, and others. She and her husband, Dan, are parents to one adult son, 2 children still at home, and they live and homeschool in Ashland, a small town near Cleveland, Ohio. And Nadia, it is great to have you on the program with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here.
Absolutely. So I got to ask, you made this transition from academia to going full-time as a mother. Well, I guess it's kind of always full-time as a mother, isn't it? And my wife works as a teacher as well, and she's also got this, feels like this full-time burden of thinking about the kids, which she does way better than I do. And I'm not sure if that's like a built-in thing or if it's just me not being that good at thinking about what the kids need. But it's like she's a master at that. But I would love for you to talk about that transition, and because I know you bring it up in the book, you talk about it, and even some of the how that transition really exposes some of the things that you experienced during that transition, how it exposes some of the cultural issues that you start to address in this book. I'd love for you to talk about that.
Absolutely. There is there are so many expectations that we have for ourselves and for others, like what you were saying. It's like, oh, is my wife a better parent, or like, is it a built-in or what? And I mean, they're both things. And so much of it is like this call that God gives us as parents to grow. I think a lot about the qualifications for elders that we get in Timothy and Titus. The idea that, like, why does an elder have to be married and have kids? Like, what happens when you have kids? And you were just describing that. Anyway, but to get to your question, we were homeschooling all along, and both my husband and I were professors, and we were just juggling these insane schedules. And for many years, it felt like it was worth it that we were able to, like have it all, if you will, that both of us had these full-time careers. We were homeschooling our kids, and my husband has always been very involved. He was homeschooled himself, and it was amazing. It was also exhausting. I would be up until like 3 a.m. grading. Um, and it felt just overwhelming. But for a long time, it also felt like it was worth it, that we were making a difference. We were at this university that's a secular state university, but it was thriving. Um, the president of the university for many of the years that I was there was actually like an active PCA church member. We went to the same church. But then there was this right in the middle of the pandemic. So in 2020, it was shut down. All of us were teaching online, and a lot of my teaching load was online already by then. But we had a new president come into the university, and it just completely transformed work culture. It became so obviously secular, dehumanizing, and just not valuing faculty or students or persons. And at the same time, also, I had this, like, if you will, early midlife crisis. It was kind of like, what am I doing with my life? I was almost 40 and just decided,
I
for
get
the
that.
first time, yeah, like for the first time, I decided I'm going to start writing for an hour a day. And my wonderful, wonderful husband would take the kids from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. every afternoon. He would take the kids outside to our yard because, social distancing and all that. Like, our yard was fine, and I don't know what the neighbors thought. Actually, the neighbors were lovely, but anyway, and they would just play, like dig holes, climb the tree, um, and I sat at the kitchen island and wrote for an hour before. Then we would like reconvene, have a nice dinner, and all that. So that's how it all started, and all of it like proved to be this incredible blessing because I started publishing more, writing for public venues. Current got started, and both my husband and I were writing for Current, and um, and again, work was getting more miserable. And there was this aha moment for me in 2023 where I realized, like, why am I doing this? This job is really miserable. I no longer feel like I have the opportunity to make a difference in my students' lives because the university administration is fighting against me tooth and nail. It was this like crisis. Like, how can I be a faithful Christian in a secular state university that does not value my work? And so I decided, like, I don't, it was this aha moment, like, I don't have to do this? And
Mm,
so I handed in my resignation. And the next week, my husband got the interview for the job in Ashland. So it's
that's
like,
awesome.
yeah. And it really felt like God was working through this, that like God was showing us, like, okay, here's a door. Um, and so, I mean, we loved our previous town. But we love Ashland, Ohio, where the cost of living is so low that like we can live on one salary. It's like, you guys, big cities are expensive. And I mean, we
Yes.
weren't we weren't in a big city in Georgia, but still, rural, like Midwest, that's where it's at. Like, you want to live on one
Yes.
income, raise a family, like family-friendly towns. This is where it's at. Highly
Yes.
recommend.
I agree. I absolutely agree. I lived in the Midwest for
Mm.
several years, probably
Mhm.
9 years, I think.
Oh,
With
yeah.
my wife, we worked at that's where all three of our children were born in Dayton,
Mhm.
Ohio.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
So the cost of living when we bought our first house was so much less than what I was anticipating and what we had even experienced like in the beginning of our marriage on the East Coast. We're back now in the East Coast in the Richmond, Virginia area, and it's
Oh,
like,
yeah.
man, it is
Mm.
absolutely expensive and the cost is highlighting. And that's one of the things, right, that you bring up in your book about kind of these obstacles that it feels like
Mhm.
people have to having a family, raising children, kind of going through the cycle that we watched our parents go through, so to speak. And now things have been shifting. So I would love for you to kind of talk about what has been shifting, what's been going on that
Mhm.
has changed? Like, what kind of cultural values have changed that you bring out in your book particularly towards mothers and children, but even how that connects to the broader cultural trends that we're seeing. How's the family doing right now as a concept in America?
Yeah. Tim Carney's book, Family Unfriendly, came out after I already handed this one into copy edits and all that, or I would have engaged with it more. But he answers this question really well. My focus is on how we're moving in a post-Christian direction. So my focus, a lot of it is not just cultural, but more theological. Like, what does it look like to live in a post-Christian society? Because that's what we're seeing, the attitudes towards mothers and children. Um, like there's a whole genre of essays now over the past few years uh, arguing that mothers are more miserable, that like if you have kids, your life is ruined. There are all these like TikTok speakers who do the who talk about this, like how much better their life is without kids, perhaps in some cases even without marriage. So the idea of like choose you, you're your best friend, you're your best companion, and all of that, which of course is a lie. And people like Brad Wilcox have looked at the data, and it's not true. Like people who are married and have kids are actually happier. And this is not to say that like we shouldn't value singles in the church. And by the way, singles in the church also do beautiful, beautiful ministry. I mean, we've seen this since the New Testament. And yet, the denigration right now in our culture towards mothers and children is very is a sign of a devaluing of personhood at large. So that's what I'm arguing, that if you look at how people right now talk about mothers and children in like secular media, it's really showing a disdain for human beings in general. Like, you know, machines are more effective. Machines don't have needs. They don't have demands. They don't make you wake up in the middle of the night to feed them or, you know, change a
No.
diaper, or like they don't throw up on you when they're sick. People do that. And so there's whole idea of like people are inconvenient. But my point is, this is very much a post-Christian idea. It brings up the question of like, what would life be like if God didn't exist? And especially if the idea of the Imago Dei, the notion that we are all, like every single one of us, are made in the image of a loving God. What if that weren't true? And that's what the post-Christian message about human beings is, that you're inconvenient. Machines are better, more effective, can do things faster, better. They don't get tired. Um, and so that's what I'm looking at. The Imago Dei, this incredible truth that the ancient Jews and Christians knew, that we see in the Bible, is what we really need to recover today. Without it, yeah, people don't matter.
So, talk to me about the Imago Dei. What is it? So, we have a very broad listenership, and so some of them might be very familiar, some of them might not have ever heard that concept before. Thinking about someone who is an intelligent, reasonable person, they can understand the concepts, but they're not really familiar with the Imago Dei concept. What is that? Why is it important?
Yeah, and of course, you know, in theology, just like in every like discipline, you have the little like zingy 30-cent phrases or words. And Imago
Yes.
Dei in Latin, literally the image of God. So of course, like once we throw Latin into the conversation, yeah, it's more serious. So like go ahead, name drop it
Yes.
later in conversation, like you will sound like a serious theologian. But anyway, to backtrack, to go back to Genesis, when we get the description that God created people in his own image. So this is like back to the creation narrative. So we have the whole like 6 days of creation, and it all keeps building up until God creates the first people. And the description there is that God created them in his own image. And that's what is picked up in the theological concept of the Imago Dei, that every single one of us is made in God's image. That truth from the beginning, it was there from the first person ever created, and it's still true today. And if we embrace it as a foundational concept of belief in God, in Christianity, then it changes everything. Like if you look at every person that you ever meet as an image bearer of God, that changes how you see that person.
Absolutely, it does. I mean, it's changed the way that I see myself. It's changed the way that I see my children. It's changed
Yes.
the way that I see people that maybe have a handicap or have something that is making it more difficult for them. You know, how do we find intrinsic value outside of, and if it is only in our utility, as you were mentioning, in our ability to be like machines and efficient, then that's going to create quite a complex of issues when it comes to human dignity and human and even compassion and what worth and value, where that is found intrinsically. And I would love for you to dig in a little bit more to that, because we've talked about machines, like this kind of analogy of machines, but part of your book, right, a large part of it is going back to understand how the early Christians understood human value, and how taking some of those teachings and theological principles that were espoused by the early church and the Jewish worldview of this Imago Dei, how did the early Christians treat people? How did they see human value and worth? And how did that contrast with the Greco-Roman worldview of that time?
Yeah, that is a big question, essentially an economic question that I get into in the book. So, with both the pre-Christian kind of pagan values and today with a post-Christian idea, we very much like this utilitarian principle of what are you contributing to society? So if that is the main
Mm.
question that you ask, then a lot of people are going to come up short. And like you mentioned, people with disabilities, like that's an obvious one. So a baby with, say, like Down syndrome, is that baby ever going to grow up to be a contributing member of society who like pays their way in the world, contributing to the GDP? No. Are they going to be a delight to their family? Yes. Um, and are they a delight in God's eyes? Absolutely, 100%. So to go back to the ancient world, there as well, I mentioned the earliest Roman law code that we have, the 12 tables. It has a clause in it that the father of the household has an obligation to kill a disabled infant. Like
Oh
if an
my
infant
word.
is, like a child is born
An
visibly disabled,
obligation.
an obligation. That one is not even a choice. It's an obligation, the way it's phrased. Why? Because such a person is inconvenient to the Roman state. It's like a mark of shame, even. It's not just that it's a drain on economic resources, because in that case, you could say, like, well, if the family can support that child, they can keep it. But no, in that case, it's just so extreme that it's not just an economic drain on resources, but something much worse in the Roman eyes. By contrast, the early Christians, so we hear of them rescuing infants, but an even bigger one, example of valuing people differently, is how they treated single women and widows. So I get into that in the book because in a lot of, like, we have, today we have this narrow definition of what does it mean to be pro-life. It means protecting unborn life, which is true. That is very important, but it's so much more than that. And the early Christians demonstrate that. And in fact, the ministry of Jesus demonstrates this so clearly. So an example that I find particularly profound is Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So you have this household of three singles who are living together in this village of Bethany, not far from Jerusalem. And we get hints of their relationship, the closeness they have to Jesus, that every time he passes through Bethany, he comes by, like he spends time with them, he visits, he cares for them. Um, so, what is their story? And reading kind of between the lines, connecting the dots, what we see is here are three single people. Where are their parents? Presumably, like they were orphaned when they were younger. And all three are single and not married. Now, it would have been the responsibility of the male in the household to arrange marriages for the young women. Well, who's the male in the house? Lazarus. He is sick. I mean, in fact, Jesus raises him from the dead at one point because he's so sick. He cannot fulfill the responsibilities that society has for him. And so the sisters are the ones kind of trying to like hold it together while their brother is so horribly sick to the point of, again, death. So they've never been married because no one arranged their marriages. Like no one in this village cares for them. They are alone. This is the definition of just orphans, like to the extreme
Wow.
degree. Yeah, singles. And keep in mind that in the ancient world, there were no safety networks of the sort we have today. Um, sure, in the Old Testament law, there is like some provision, for widows and orphans to glean in the fields after everybody else is done. Like we see this in Ruth, for instance. This is how Ruth and
Yes.
Naomi are planning to like make it. But it's very precarious. And so in the case of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, what we see is just real orphans, singles who are damaged goods in the rest of the society's eyes. And Jesus cares for them. Jesus spends so much time with them, more than others. And I'm arguing that that's part of what it means to be genuinely pro-life, is caring for those kinds of people, the ones that the society, like the rejects, if you will, of the society. And that's what we see. And that is something that is really humbling and is a good reminder for us today that it is these people who love Jesus the most sometimes and really need our care today as well. This being pro-life means seeing them the way Jesus saw them.
Why do you think it's so important that we see the marginalized and that we care for them? Like, besides being a moral thing to do, which I certainly think it is, and it's an important thing because it's a moral thing. But maybe even going a little bit deeper, I'd love to get your insights. Why is it so important to protect, to care for, and to love the marginalized? Why did God place such importance on this?
One aspect of it is that all of us will be in that boat sometime. All of us entered the world as defenseless babies who needed someone to
Yes.
do everything for us. And all of us will exit the world. I mean, not all, but if we live long enough, if we're blessed with a long life, we will also end our life in a stage of helplessness. And the two are very much connected. And by the way, like euthanasia, the rise of euthanasia in Canada and now in some countries in Europe shows that aspect of like what happens in a secular society that says you're only worth what you're useful for. Like if the economic test of usefulness is the one that's used for kind of estimating your worth to society, then euthanasia for the elderly or the sick makes sense. So that is something that the early church has in response, that no, these people are important because every single one of us is like them, at least at some point in our lives. And God delights in this weakness. I mean, that's like the Sermon on the Mount, like all over again, that blessed are the meek. Like, what does it look like? And those weak, helpless people. It looks like babies, the elderly, the sick, and really it looks like every single one of us at some points in our lives.
Yeah, that's really remarkable. I think about how the secular worldview, which I would even love for you, like in answering this next question, to kind of describe even maybe in to the best that you can in your mind and the study you've done of what secular really is. Even I think that's a term that's thrown out. So maybe even before I go into the next thing, give us a baseline understanding of what do we even mean when we're talking about secular versus what? What's the alternative to secular? I mean, I say Christian, but I'm sure there are other ones as well. What's kind of the baseline difference, do you think?
I think about it in terms of anthropology. So obviously, like how we see God makes a difference. Like people who are secular people might say like they're either agnostics, so like they don't care if God exists or not, like it doesn't seem to be of importance to them, or they might be atheists, like God doesn't exist. Okay, so leave God aside from all conversations. Whereas people who believe in God are obviously going to have a view of humanity that is predicated on the existence of God. So I think that's a big difference. But in that case, also, what I would say is Christianity and really Judaism are the two that I would put together versus any other religion. So in Judaism and in Christianity, you have this idea of anthropology, like who people are, defined in connection to God. that we are made in the image of God, and that's what makes us precious and valuable and priceless in God's eyes. In any other philosophical or theological system, people don't have that value.
Hmm.
I mean, in Hinduism, for example, there's the whole caste system that classifies people. Like, some of you are worth more than others. Like, that's the whole system. Whereas in Judaism and Christianity, you have that statement that from the beginning, in God's eyes, every single human being is precious. So for me, like, that's the big difference. Obviously, different people might define secularism and Christianity differently. There are all kinds of loaded kind of things involved in those definitions, but my focus is on an anthropology angle. Like, what does it mean in each system? How do we think about people specifically? Who are people and why are they important or not in the secular vision?
And so when you have a secular vision that has to make some kind of value proposition on people, and of course we've been saying this, it goes to utilitarianism,
Mhm.
which is this sense that the person's worth is only tied up in what they can produce.
Yeah.
But is that like inevitable, do you think, with secularism and other kinds of worldviews? Is there something kind of baked into the cake, so to speak, where it's like, unless you have an Imago Dei kind of understanding in theology, you're essentially going to diminish the value of people eventually? Do you think something like that is at play, or is there something else?
I think ancient history gives us a hint. This is where it's so fascinating to look at the world before Christianity. Because in theory, like, we'd like to think that people have some compassion that they're born with, right?
Yeah.
And yet you look at society after society after society in the ancient world, apart from Judaism and Christianity. And what you see is remarkably similar. What you see is a world of incredible cruelty, um, and just attacks on the weak, and the idea that your worth as a human being depends on the eyes of the beholder, which is terrifying. And it is Judaism and Christianity, the idea of the Imago Dei, that makes a difference. Now, today, a lot of people might say, like, well, no, we have this innate compassion. And what I would say is actually no. What you think is your innate compassion, like your nature as a good person, is the result of 2,000 years of Christianity. We have been breathing 2,000 years of
Right.
Christianity that has transformed us. But the post-Christian ethos is now slowly eroding it. We are losing that. So give it some more time. I don't know how much time, but given more time, I think this kind of cruelty, the pre-Christian pagan world, is going to come back. There's a really beautiful essay that we are repaganizing in First Things, from Louis Perry,
Hmm.
a couple of, I guess, a year and a half ago. And that's what she talks about, that very phenomenon. And Tom Holland's book, Dominion, is all about that, that those
Yes.
2,000 years of Christianity, they've made a huge difference, and we take it for granted. We shouldn't.
So, which this is absolutely, absolutely fascinating. And I feel like people that don't understand history, that don't understand how to look at history, not to say like make some judgment on them. I'm not trying to say some negative um, judgment on them, because it's not necessarily intuitive, and it's not necessarily it's not equally important to everyone in terms of their values to be able to understand how to read history. It's
Yeah.
just not that, it's important for the science of it, for the discipline of it. But most people, they're just kind of like, they take things and whatever they feel when they hear it, then that's what the truth is for them at that point. But I would love to dig into this more, because I feel like this is such a misunderstood thing, that the reason that we have rights, the reason that we have these values, the reason that we have all these things that we've cherished in Western thinking and Western like understanding in society, is because we had a Western society that was deeply and inextricably right connected to Christianity and to the values of Christianity. which of course no one ever did it perfectly. And of course, there are many atrocities and all these things done through the history. And yet there's something about this core understanding of people that has made it so that we can, have value in others. And how exactly is it that this value is being eroded? What's going on to erode this these values that have been with us for thousands of years? How can this be taking place?
That's a good question. And as an ancient historian, maybe I'm not as well equipped to answer the modern side of it. Although I will say for Christians, like what you were saying, that there's maybe a lot of people feel like history is not as important for them. I would say Christianity is an incredibly historically grounded faith. So
Yes.
if you want to really connect to the world of the Bible, if you want your Bible reading to be richer and more accessible, you really need to know the history. You need to know the contrast between the values of the earliest believers and the Roman Empire in which they lived, because that was a huge aspect of their conversion. Like, why was Jesus so incredibly like attractive? Why were his teachings so attractive in the context of the Roman Empire? Well, you will understand this if you know more about the cruelty of the world of the Roman Empire. Now today, why is this being eroded? I think, I mean, there's so much going on, and the great dechurching is certainly playing a role. Now there are so many, I mean, there are so many stories, of course, like there are conversations now about church hurt and all of that, and I don't want to diminish those, but at the same time, it seems like a lot of times people who deconstruct are throwing away the baby with the bathwater. Um, and so seeing, for instance, Christians advocate for abortion rights is just horrifying. People who say they're Christians, where it's like, no, this is, you are adopting some pagan values into your um, Christianity, if you will. So there are a lot of problematic beliefs where I would say we need to go back to the world of the Bible and see what is going on, like the what is the anthropology that Jesus is advocating for, because it's still transformative. It is beautiful and it is full of compassion that we need right now for each other, like regardless different people's backgrounds with church.
I absolutely love that. This idea of this Christian ethic, right, that value life so deeply, and the need for us to re-examine ourselves and reach back into the past to understand, not just to be Christian, but to understand the moral foundations of our culture that so many of us want to keep, right? We want to keep this emphasis on love for the individual, that each person is important and all of that. But how do we keep that when other parts of this interconnected picture are being eroded? And so it's like, what it's almost like you have to look and see, okay, Christianity created it essentially set this foundation, and there are these pillars, and how interconnected are these pillars, and which ones, when they get taken away, there's a structural issue at that point. There's a structural issue. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing, that even from your book and from the idea of how families are looked at right now, is this idea of what the family is, this idea of who mothers are, the importance of mothers and children is one of these pillars that's so important structurally for this worldview to hold. I would love for you to disagree with that, agree with that, and then kind of explain what are these structured things, and where does motherhood and children, why is that so important, a society's view on those roles?
Yeah, there's a lot here. And a lot of it comes back to culture, kind of like what I looked at in my first book, Cultural Christians in the Early Church. And what I argued is that it's really easy today to be a Christian on Sunday. You go to church, it's wonderful. And then you come home, and then Monday you go to work, and your kids go to school, and like all those other things happen. And you kind of forget, like you kind of compartmentalize your Christianity, your faith walk, for the rest of the week without really intending to, simply because it's modern America and it's easy to do that. So that's kind of, we take this for granted. And as a result, it's really easy, if we're not trying to resist this phenomenon, it's really easy for Christians to go to church on Sunday and to be just like the rest of the society the rest of the week. It's simply convenient. Like, this is what everybody else does. And so you absorb
Absolutely.
societal attitudes on marriage, on child rearing, on money, you name it, food and drink. And like, that's all of this becomes suddenly like part of the church also, where you have culture from the secular world seeping in and influencing you, and you didn't even realize it. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. And the early church struggled with it too. We're always, the whole idea of called to be in the world but not of it. That's where it gets really difficult, like for families. And the economic situation in this country doesn't make it easier, because in a lot of places, you really do have to have both parents working, for example. And there are all these studies about how that can end up limiting family size. Um, I'm an academic woman with a PhD. The vast majority of women with PhDs have very few kids. Many of them have none. Uh,
Hmm.
Many others I've known had only one. So, like, that's very common. Why? Because that's kind of the life you lock yourself into. And so there are all of these expectations, like, not to say that any one of those things is a poor choice, but the problem becomes is that you have societal expectations. And the question then is, what is God calling you to? And how can you reconcile those? How can you be a Christian in whatever your workplace or like calling in the 21st century? And I think a lot of us have never had the opportunity to sit down and think about it in earnest.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Part of what you do in your book that I would love to work through is you make the case, you kind of bring the problem out, right? In the first part, you're talking about the early Christians and their views on motherhood, children, and all that, and then you bring the three thinkers at the end. There's two ancient ones and there's one modern one. What do the who like what are these thinkers, and how do they contribute to the conversation and help us think through these issues today?
Yeah, I didn't want this to be this discouraging book where I just like point out the problem and like, throw a bomb into the crowded room and leave. Because that's what it kind of felt like I was doing, especially in the first part of the book. Like, here are all the problems. Here's everything that's wrong. Like, somebody else can sort it out. I'm not a policymaker, which I'm not. But anyway, but yeah, I liked bringing in those three voices of life kind of to help us recover better discourse of how we talk about human beings, how we talk about treasuring people. And so the first of the thinkers is Perpetua. She was a convert in the very early third century AD, and she was martyred for her faith. And what's really striking is that she had an infant at the time, probably right around 1 year old, because she weans him in prison. And she leaves this really beautiful journal. That she wrote in prison, like while awaiting martyrdom. And it's so striking because here's this mother making an impossible choice. Like, who wants to leave their 1 year old and die for Christ? And she does. And she feels like it's worth it. But in the process, she talks about kind of what I would call eternal priorities. And that's something we perhaps don't think about in our comfortable lives. We don't think about enough. Like, what are earthly priorities? Like, things that have to be done, that are nice. But what are eternal priorities? It's really easy to get weighed down by daily kind of necessary priorities. Like, I mean, I have to go to the grocery store every week. Like, some things are non-negotiable, right? People people in this house seem to want
Yes.
3 meals a day. Like, I don't know why. But anyway, but but then there are eternal priorities where like God says, like, here's living water. Like, you will never thirst again if you
Yes.
have it.
Yes.
And that
Yes.
like brings this into contrast. And Perpetua does a beautiful job of thinking through those eternal priorities and the earthly priorities. The earthly priorities matter. Like, and we can see she loves her baby. It's not that she just wants to abandon her baby and die in the arena. And yet it is precisely because of her love for her baby that she loves Jesus more, which is so like striking, this voice of life, like thinking about eternal priorities. And then the second thinker I bring in is Augustine, who had a pretty like wild and crazy youth, and then had this remarkable conversion, and then have had a long life of serving the church as a bishop, essentially a pastor. Like, we don't think enough about Augustine as a pastor, the guy who would like serve his particular flock, and he
Yes.
did. And so much of his writing is concerned with this pastoral care of souls that were entrusted in his care. And he felt that burden deeply. And he wanted them to live and live rich, theologically rich lives. We don't think of him as like warm and fuzzy, and he wasn't. But so much of his writing is about like, what does it mean to live a beautiful, meaningful life in the face of suffering? And there was a lot of suffering that he observed,
Yes.
and he wrote about, especially in The City of God, and that's the book that I focus on in my discussion of Augustine here in this case study. That he had to pastor survivors of the fall of Rome, um, just the Gothic sack of Rome in 410, which was brutal. And it really bothered him that some survivors later on committed suicide. And he wanted to address this incredible suffering and explain why the lives of all believers mattered. And then the last thinker I talk about in the book is Wendell Berry, who is very much like the Augustine of our age, as some
Hmm.
have said, very much like thinking about human flourishing. So what does it mean to be not just pro-life, but pro-human flourishing? Like, what does it
Yes.
mean to be flourishing where God has planted us in this admittedly imperfect world right now?
That's so good. You know what? There's going to be some listeners that hear this, and some mothers that are feeling like stuck. Like, let me just give you a sense. Like, my wife and I, we came here to Richmond. We planted a church. We've labored together. We've worked. It got to a point financially where she had to work. She loved doing it. She's always been in the workforce in some capacity. But then when we moved here, she was just with the kids for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, and then started to work and has worked in the school system. And she'll come home and she'll say things like, I feel so disconnected from the home. It's so weird to feel this disconnected from the home. And I got to be honest, I don't know if I've ever had that thought. And I'm not like saying like that's good or bad or whatever. I mean, and I'm sure there are many men that do have those thoughts, but I've never felt like, oh, I need to be more, you know, I miss connection to the home or something like that. And yet for my wife, it's so important, like her identity as a mother. And I don't even know if I'm saying this right, because my identity as a father is important to me. It's not as if it's unimportant, but it just manifests differently. I don't know how else to say it. It's just the way she thinks, the things that she gets burdened about, the things that she wonders, the things that she feels bad about have to do with her identity as a mother many times, and then as a wife as well. But even more than like as a Christian is as a mother, and there's the expectations of things that she should be doing or ways that she should be living. And it's like she does this creative work in her school. She's enjoyed that, and yet there's this draw to the home that she feels. And what how have we what do you think is the underlying issue there? I mean, obviously, the psychology of it and her going and getting whatever, if she needed to talk with a therapist or whoever, and same with me. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about more of the cultural issues that you studied. Is what she's feeling normal? Is it abnormal culturally? Is it something? And how do we get here to this place where it feels like so many women, mothers who want to be a mother and also want to have a work, like a career, they feel so stuck and like they can't move forward with it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Or like they're perpetually
Yeah.
not meeting whatever goal it is, professional, family, whatever.
It's a reminder that we're limited. Like God made us limited. Like we have a finitude that God doesn't have. And this is like our feature of humanity. This is what makes us human and like machines that could keep going 24/7 and meet all the goals, right? Productivity. We're not machines. Like and that's okay. In fact, it's beautiful. Um, but it's also funny, as you were describing your wife's desire to be at home more, like be connected. I was reminded of Betty Friedan's, of course, like transformative for American culture, like feminist manifesto. The feminine mystique, which I briefly talk about in the introduction to my book, because that was her argument, of course, was the opposite. Her argument was like women are not satisfied at home. They need to get out in the workforce where their brains are going to
Yes.
be valued. They're going to be contributing to society. It's going to be so much better. Well, now we've had several generations of women trying this out. And instead, there's a record number, especially since the pandemic, of women choosing to stay home and saying, like, no, that was a lie. We've been sold a lie. And I think the answer is obviously like each family has different callings, and especially when it comes to like figuring out like how do you serve faithfully where you are, and like sometimes you really do have to have two people working, like that's not negotiable. And if that's your situation, then like you pursue ministry through that. But it does involve recognizing that God sees our like limits, and God loves our limits, and it's a beautiful reminder that we are human, and we are beloved of God who is unlimited. So I think that would be an important thing. I will add to that a totally like different
Yeah.
observation that is not theological. America is burning out its teachers. Like I have yet to meet a single teacher in the
Mm.
last few years who was not burned out to an extreme degree. So I'll stop with that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and it seems like our system, I don't know what we're doing, but it seems like our system, either we have to pay more so they can feel like the work that they're doing is worth it, not only paying more, but then also giving more, I don't know what the solutions are. I
Yeah.
feel like there's a lot of work with not a lot of pay,
Mhm.
and then a lot of pressure,
Yeah.
and that's an equation and a recipe for feeling burned out.
It
When
is.
you
Yeah.
are doing a bunch of stuff, you don't feel like you're being rewarded
Mhm.
adequately for the work that you're doing.
Mhm.
It's hard enough even when you are to be doing that, to be doing it and not feel like it's being valued.
Mhm.
That's got to speak to the sense of identity that you
Mhm.
have when you're like, hey, this work I'm doing is really hard. And I think it connects to the
Mhm.
issues of motherhood. It's like she's never had a job, and I've never had a job as difficult as raising kids.
Mhm.
Not even close. Has it been that I've had a job, or that she's had a job that has been as emotionally and intellectually and in every way straining?
Mhm.
Now, it's definitely worth it. I mean, I love
Yeah.
my kids, and maybe our value propositions are way off.
Mhm.
in this country because it's like, or just maybe in Western society, or maybe it's all over the world. I don't know. I can only speak to my context, but it's like it feels like our value system is way off because we're like, it's just a recipe for never being content, never being happy.
Well, and
Because,
Augustine,
go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. Well, Augustine speaks to that when he says, like, our hearts will be restless until they rest in him. So this is
Yes.
again, like the post-Christian world allows no path for rest. We are just
No.
chasing the machines. And that's the thing, like, but the answer is rest in God. And we're writing ourselves out of that answer.
Yes, we are. And it's like I think this is such an important topic because I feel like so much of the view of value drives so much of culture and so much of behavior
Yeah.
is how the culture assigns value.
Mhm.
And if it assigns value to you basically on your ability to work or be free or to whatever it is that we put up as the good life, the blessed life,
Yeah.
right? And then what does Jesus put up? He puts up the Beatitudes
Mhm.
as the picture of the blessed life. And
Yeah.
we've gone through that as a church. And I don't even know if I can find a set of more countercultural
Mhm.
values than what I'm looking at. And these are the values of the kingdom, right? That you're blessed when you mourn. That you have that you're blessed when you're merciful. That you're blessed when you're poor in spirit. Like these things that feel very countercultural to us, and yet like it feels like there's such peace and understanding, like Jesus' message of God didn't create you to necessarily be in this rat race, right? But to be in connection with each other, with Him, this deep, loving connection. And our assignment of values, especially assigning the values of when I'm thinking about motherhood and children, we have made those so negative in our culture that you have like I don't know. There's a story that and I'm trying to remember. It was the one. It's the idea about the book about the rabbit, right?
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
That is Daddy Rabbit, right? So it's
Mhm.
like this pursuit, right? It's right there at the beginning, but this idea of
Mhm.
hey, there's I want to be a dad when I grow up. I want to be a mom when I grow up, and I think about my kids, and they look at us, and my son said to me the other day, Dad, I don't know if I can ever get married. And I'm like, why not?
Ooh. Mhm.
I'm like, why not? And he's 11. I'm like, why not? What are you talking about? And he's like, I don't know, man. I just feel like I'm going to be like, it's just going to be too hard. I'm going to be too, like, I don't know. I'm going to want to do my own thing.
Oh.
And it's like,
Mm.
I'm like, well, buddy, it's so good. I'm trying to talk to him. Like, man, we're a very loving family. We try to be very close. We try to hang out together. I mean, obviously we're not, there's many ways in which we fail the ideal, but it's like there's this overall sense that he's getting that like a family gets in the way of my happiness.
Yeah,
And
that's
that's
selling.
patently untrue.
It is, but it's a message that keeps selling really well. I mean, just this morning, one of the headlines I saw was child um, birth rates in Britain just hit an all-time low. And of course, in America, they have too. So all over the
Man.
world, like there are a lot of people who are buying this secular lie that like having kids is just like gets in the way of having a good life.
What? And I know we only have a few minutes left, and we've kind of gone like in several different directions, and
All
I
good.
love that. Um, but let's to go full circle. Why why is this secular lie winning? like in your, not winning, I don't know, but why is it so popular? In what can we do to counter this? What can we do to give a different story, a different view?
I think the church has a role to play in this because the great dechurching, I think, is connected to this. If you believe that you alone can solve all your problems, then a life like that makes sense. But if you see community, if you see life as part of being of a community, something that makes a difference, that is meaningful in company of other people, then it looks different. Um, and I mean, there are secular studies also about how people who have friends who are married happily are more likely to get married and be married like happily. People who have friends with kids are also more likely to have, to have kids and more kids and all that. So there is that sense of like healthy community supports healthy community. And I think the church has a part to play in this. Obviously, this is theological too. Um, and it all is rooted in that healthy anthropology, the idea of remembering that like God delights in persons. And so as a church, you get to delight in each other, not just on Sunday, but every day. And it's so beautiful. The bride of Christ is beautiful. And like that is the story that will lead to all the good things in life. Um, but but that's like the question of like how do you get to that? So I would encourage people to plug into a healthy church community that will support you as a person and that will show you that life alone is, man, that's hard and depressing and will make you only think that, well, perhaps you have more problems and you need to solve them alone and all of that. It's just kind of an endless cycle of what Tim Carney calls civilizational sadness.
Yeah, and we had Tim Carney on the show
Oh,
before to
good.
talk about Family Unfriendly, and that was an
Mhm.
amazing conversation, amazing book. But it's totally true, and it
Mhm.
feels like, how do we get out of this trap? Because
Yeah.
it just feels like a trap. It's so pervasive, it's so intense. So many people. I think about with our kids and our family, and like, we don't have our kids in sports right now. I don't have like an issue. I grew up in sports, but I know that like those things have completely taken over people's lives where they don't get community in any other way. And
Mhm.
like spiritual community, church, it literally becomes, and this has been like this for as long as I've been in full-time ministry. And
Mm.
I'm sure it was like this before, but it's like it's the most optional thing that people have on their calendar. You know,
Yeah.
it's like if anything comes up, then they'll do that. And even people that like are very committed. And it's just it's interesting to me trying to work through this I mean this cultural trend that we have that moves us away from the kind of community that we need most most deeply.
Yeah.
And it's really sad. I mean, there are so many questions, by the way, I have for you, but we don't really have time. But I would let you respond to anything there that you wanted to, if any thoughts came to your mind before I ask my last question.
I think mothers especially feel that need for community. And that's been kind of like you look across civilizations, like mothers seek each other. And that's, yeah,
It's
because you
super
feel,
important.
yeah, because you feel like when you're caring for a helpless infant, especially, you feel like I can't do this alone. And it's the truth. Like
Yes.
it's that truth that we sometimes suppress. When we're fully healthy and all that, it's easy to say like I can do anything alone, and it's not true.
No, it's definitely not true. It just takes one bout with
Mhm.
depression, one bout with, any of the mental health litany that we have, or
Yeah.
physical, impairments and diseases. It just takes one thing to realize, man, I don't have much control at all.
No.
And I can't really do this on my own
Mm.
at all. And yet we still are fed and believe the lie that we can. It's amazing. And I don't mean that in the best sense of the term, right?
No,
It's like, this is like,
definitely not.
what is going on
Mhm.
that this is happening? You know, if you were to hear stories about this book and how it's made an impact on people and how, people have been changed by it, or they've taken some kind of action or some kind of new route, new way, new path. What kind of stories would you look to hear that would kind of like cue you in? Hey, this is making the difference that I set out for it to make when I put pen to paper, so to speak.
I'd love for people to read this and say, wow, God loves me. Like, I see how God delights in me. So that would be a big one.
That is awesome. Well, how can people get the book? How can they connect with you? And what do you have? What other projects do you have coming up?
Yeah, you can buy it on Amazon or InterVarsity Press website. And I know some Christian bookstores have it, although I guess Christian bookstores are kind of like this tiny uh, thing these days.
Niche thing? Yes.
Niche, yeah. Gotta love the niche, though. This is a good niche.
Yes.
Um, I and I'm also at my writing at currentpub.com, where I also run a blog, The Arena, and I have a Substack. I mean, everybody has a Substack these days, I guess. But
But
I just turned in my next book. It's just gone to copy edits at Zondervan Academic. It's called Christians Reading Classics. So a
hmm,
lot of times people ask me, like, what else should I read to understand the early church better? And I say, read the pagans, the people that the earliest converts to Christianity read, and that
yes,
shaped their worldview in the sense of pointing them to Jesus and realizing, the world without God makes no sense. And so that book is coming in September of 2025.
that's awesome. We'll have to have you back on to talk about that book because
Would love
that
that.
sounds fascinating to me. Well, thank you so much for being on the program today, Nadia. It was a real pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us. Make sure that you pick up Nadia's book, Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic, Ancient Christianity and the Recovery of Human Dignity. We'll put links in the show notes for you to go and get that when it's convenient for you. We definitely want you guys to read that and check out her other works. We'll put links into those as well. And until next time, guys, we love you and appreciate all your support. And I hope that you take care. God bless, guys.